just before we kick off, I think I'll just start with some housekeeping. So welcome to the webinar. In terms of the webinar today, we're going to do a presentation which will probably last around about the first 60 minutes before we kick into a Q&A at the end. We do want to give you an opportunity to have a discussion at the end. So we are going to ask that you keep all your questions for the end. You don't have to keep, you can put them in the Q&A box throughout the session, but we will be referring to them at the end of the session. If you want to have a chat to anyone, or if you just want to make a comment or whatever, use the chat box for just general comments and thoughts, but please put your actual questions into the Q&A box and we will go to them at the end of the session. So welcome everyone to our webinar, which has, I guess, been the culmination of the almost 2 years worth of work. It's coming up for 2 years when the announcement that Kiwi Bank stepped out and said that they were going to be ending cheques. So that process kicked off a strong response, and it was the start of the FINZ working group. For the last 24 months, there's been a lot of work been going on behind the scenes, and I do want to highlight at the very beginning of this webinar that it became quite apparent quite early on that the decision that the banks have made was final, and that we were not going to be able to lobby or change the end result. So in terms of today, this is, like I said, it's a combination of all the work that we've been doing, and this is about moving forward. As I said, it's clear we're not going to be able to change the bank's mind. We do understand that there is some charities out there whose role it is to still advocate for their members or those that might be disadvantaged with this situation, and they're still campaigning for on a different level. But for us, we're working to moving forward. This session is designed to take the knowledge that we know and what we've learned over the last 18 to 24 months and information that we know will help you to be proactive and turn what I think initially seemed like a bit of a disaster into a great opportunity for donor engagement and better understanding of your giving channels. And that's why we brought in the expert, Fee McPhee is here, and I'm going to hand over to her because Fee has a real insight, knowledge into how we can be proactive. How are we going to mitigate the risk to our charities and move forward? So this session is going to offer you some really practical actions, hints and tips. Fee, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle. Hi, everyone out there. So what I'm going to do, as Michelle said, a lot of work's been going on in the background. Absolutely blown away by the work of the FINZ Cheque Working group as well. The fundraisers working on that, the amount of additional work they've put into this has been amazing. Michelle's going to talk a bit later about the resources that will be available to you all, particularly I'll mention the FINZ portal as I'm going through. Michelle will give you a lot more details or explain that more as we get through to the end of the session. But there's been different pieces of work going just to understand the potential impact of the removal of cheques on our programs, how donors actually are thinking and feeling about this, and then also work that different organisations have been doing to try and understand these different areas, their risk, what their donors need, what their donors think, what they might need to be doing to get set up and ready to manage this situation. And then some just ideas or some practical tips for what you might be able to go away and do as a result of what these organisations have learned. So one of the first things that FINZ did was, or one of the components of the work FINZ has been doing, was a survey to our members to better understand actually the risk of cheques being removed. 60 charities participated. That is amazing. Thank you so much to everyone who did that. It is actually quite challenging to get people to respond to surveys like this at this volume. So it does show how important it is to each of you out there as well. The full results from this survey will be made available to members through the FINZ portal. You'll be able to take a look at the detail. I haven't put all of the charts and information in today, just giving you a bit of a highlight there. But thank you so much to these organisations who participated. So we had a really good, I guess, range of organisations that responded as well. Fairly reflective, I guess, of the range of organisations we see who are fundraising from individuals in our market as well there. So those percentages are fairly reflective of what we've got happening on out there in the market. And we really are focused on those organisations who are fundraising from individuals, so individuals that might use cheques to pay their donations. We asked each of you to look at how much income you received via cheque in 2019, just as a very basic, how much revenue is coming into our organisation. With cheque as the payment. For most, the exposure is under a quarter, so sub 25%. But for me, critically understanding how this revenue is generated is going to help you identify your risk. And I'll talk through some ways that we can do that, because what we realised was what you received last year from cheques isn't necessarily your risk. What you're going to receive in subsequent years via cheques is going to change depending on the type of activity you're doing that was soliciting those donations that were coming through by cheque. But a few organisations did have fairly large representations of their revenue coming in from cheques, so their exposure to risk is quite a bit higher. If you look at that in income terms, for some, it's up in the hundreds of thousands. For others, it's under $10,000. So for each of you, the impact of the removal of cheques from our system is going to be very, very different. But for our sector overall, we know that our exposure to risk here is very large. It's very high for some programs in particular. We also asked you to have a look at to see whether or not you were receiving less donations via cheque since 2019. So what did you get last year, 2019? Did you get less via cheque in 2020? Tracking already suggests that there are changes happening within our donors' behaviours there. So we're starting to see less donations come in via cheque, and that's obviously going to be in part influenced by Kiwibank checking cheques out anyway. But we are starting to see within individual organisations donors starting to use other methods. So donors who had previously used cheque, maybe as their sole payment method or as one of their payment methods, starting to change that. So critically, I would suggest too that you want to go back into your data and have a look at what revenue you were receiving via cheque in, say, 2019, 2020. Has that changed? So are you getting less revenue from cheques? But also, does that mean it's less revenue overall, or have your donors changed their behaviours? Are they starting to use other methods? Because just looking at your cheque line may be hiding the fact that donors or funders are using different methods now with you. But we already started to see from the people responding to this survey, there are some changes happening in that space already from our donors. Another piece of research that's been incredibly helpful here was from the team at More Insight. So Gavin Coopy, I know some of you on the webinar today came along to a session we actually did looking at some of the results from this survey. Within this survey, it's a public survey that Gavin and the guys at More Insight run each year to understand the behaviours and how people view charities, particularly around trust and confidence in our market each year. So this is the general public part of the survey. About 2,000 members of the public respond to this. They identify what type of donors they are, what type of causes they might be giving to. And Gav works really hard there to get a good sort of range of age, gender and location as well, so we can start to see if there's any real differences there. Just as a side note, this runs every year. I really encourage you to participate as individual charities. You can get your own questions in. It's easily accessible, and I know several organisations have used the outcomes of this to help inform different parts of their programs as well. But let's take a look at the area that in terms of cheques, so the impact on cheques here. Lots of detail in this little slide here. You obviously get this slide deck so you can have a dig around in it in more detail here. But essentially what we were looking at is what are people's preferred ways of making donations, and that got split down by our age brackets here. So you'll start to see there is some real differences in the generations behaviour in terms of payment method. But with cheque, you can see it's up here. Cheque is a low overall percentage. used by our donors, but it's our 65 and plus over donors for whom it is more of a preferred method. And certainly for me, that's the audience that is potentially the one that we need to focus more of our efforts on. You can start to see here too, all of the other different options or different ways that people are thinking about or have been using to donate to their organisations. I encourage you to go through this list, have a think about, do you have these options available? Are these options valid for your donor base? And if not, are they something that you need to start looking at implementing now in advance of cheques being taken out across the sector? Just a note here too, online banking, this we track year on year, Gavin tracks year on year the responses in here. You can see online banking has had some ups and downs. It's actually been increasing in our 65 plus group. So our audience who prefers cheques has also been increasing their usage of online banking as well, which is heartening, I think, for the situation that we're in. If I just pull out those 65 plus donors there, you can see though, in particular, if we look at cheque in particular, it is this audience that has the highest usage rate. And these are your direct mail, your telephone, your longer term donors. These are your bequest prospects. So they are really important donors in our programs. If we go back to our FINZ survey here though, we asked, when we asked the donors within the More Insight survey as well, what they might do in terms of changing their payment methods, they don't really know. And when we asked our, when we talked here with you, people responding to the FINZ survey, those of you who had spoken to your donors asking whether or not, you know, are they indicating they're no longer going to donate? Because I know many of you have been speaking to those donors, which has been amazing. People don't know. The reality is that people, in terms of behaviour change, quite often it doesn't happen until there is real pain. So for many of our donors, we won't know and they won't know what they're going to do until cheques are gone. Yes, there's some proactive ones out there who are already starting to make changes. There are people who are, you know, working with their banks or with other resources to try and work out other ways to do their banking. But for some, it is going to simply be a case of once they're gone, then they're going to work out what they're going to do. So at the moment, people aren't necessarily able to express, and this is almost 50% from our FINZ survey here, it's too early to tell. We don't know what they're actually going to do, and they don't necessarily know as well. If we go back to the More Insights survey there as well, though, we asked people, you know, what do they think the impact of not having cheques available to them will be? And if we look at our 65 plus donors over here, our older donors, around 12% are saying, look, this might be a significant or a major problem. Okay, so a lot of them are saying, hey, we'll sort this out, or there's no issue at all. We've got other methods. We'll just make some changes. You know, a small percentage, around 3%, are saying we don't know what's going to happen, but some expect it to be a significant or a major problem. Interesting, and I thought it was quite interesting to see in that 35 to 44 age group, we had a bit of a kind of higher response saying significant. We've got to consider the volumes of people in these groups here as well, as we've broken it down. But I think this is fairly indicative of, we've got a smaller percentage of those affected who are feeling like it's going to be a really big problem for them. So if you're thinking about your exposure to risk, think about the fact that not all your cheque donors are going to find this to be a major problem for them. We asked them too to say, well, then what might you do? What might be the impact of that? And some people were saying, hey, we're just going to shift over to online banking. But some people are saying, I will have to stop making donations. And I think that that's our biggest challenge. And here it's 23%, but please do keep in mind this is small numbers. So I think it's less about the actual percentages and more about the concept that many of our donors are saying, hey, look, we'll just move over to, for example, online banking. That was the main option that people said they would transfer over to. But some are saying, hey, I'm probably going to have to stop giving. And some are saying, I don't know. So we certainly do expect there is going to be some impact on revenue in the short term, if not the long term there. Okay, so how are we tackling the challenge? So we know that there is going to be challenges. We know that people are going to be challenged. We know that there are options for our donors, but for some of them, they don't know if they're going to be suitable or they don't know what they're going to do there. So I'll hand back over here to Michelle just for a little chat about what's been happening in terms of how we're tackling this challenge.
Thanks, Faye. That was a great start to our session. So one of the questions we asked was, what charities resources effectively do you have for transitioning cheques? And I think it's really important to note that there's an assumption being made here that donors will want or need our help. And do we have evidence to suggest that is the case? That's something you will have to look at internally. Are your donors proactively asking for you to help them? What we do know is that banks have a strong and huge resource and communication plans in place. We'll talk about that a bit later in the webinar. And so that communication plan that the banks have is designed for them to communicate with their customers, for them to help their customers understand the options that are open to them as donors. And we also the banks have to be able to offer their donors options with their banks. And I think the most important thing that's come out of this is consistent messaging between what we're saying to our donors and what the banks, the journey the customer are on with their banks. And I think that's what we have been able to work over the last few weeks, is bringing that kind of consistent messaging together. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. I do want to say that the responsibility to transition cheque users to alternative methods is not our responsibility. But what our responsibility is to reinforce the impact our donors are making to their favourite causes. And so it's back to kind of that top line message that we mentioned at the beginning, was the method how your donors donate is changing, but the reason why is not. And so the why, that's our job, to reinforce the reason why, but not so much the reason how, the methods how. And also critically understanding the potential resources needed is an interesting one. So those organisations what do those additional resources look like? What are they for? What do we need to do in our organisations that the banks aren't doing, that you cannot do as part of your ongoing strategy and communications that you have with your donors anyway? So the idea that we don't have staff, what is it we need to do? I think it's really important to take a breath and think, okay, what is it that we need to do additionally to what we were already doing? And I think it's really important to be objective and focus on what you're doing and what you've always done. And again, use this as an opportunity to improve and, more importantly, accelerate your digital platforms and your alternative methods of giving. Are we moving on to the next screen? So I'm just jumping between screens. So in this next slide, it shows that charities, what's a little bit concerning is that there's still a lot of charities have not started communicating with their donors about these changes and how it's going to affect them. What's also interesting, a lot of email and social media is being used. And is this really where the affected audience is? If they donate by mail and by cheque, then it's really important you communicate to them, but in the same method that they donated to you in. So putting out social media or EDMs to an audience who only communicate via mail, I think, again, just consider looking at where your donor's donation came from. If it came from the mail, then respond to them with a letter. I had a catch up with Kiwibank yesterday, and it was really interesting for them to reflect back on what methods of communication they felt was most successful. And so they did a 3-wave letter communication. The first letter was letting them know this is going to happen. The second one was a follow-up. And then they did a final third letter, mail letter. And then they boosted it with phone calls. They found their phone calls was incredibly helpful. So yeah, just think about who your audience is, and is digital appropriate if you don't have their email address and they aren't online?
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, I do love that thinking about who is being affected, and I'm going to talk about how you might identify who they are in a minute, because what you do needs to be about the audience that is affected here. But I love the key message there from Michelle too, is let's not, and you'll see me say this a few times today, don't admin your donors. Okay, this is an administrative issue for us, But for our donors, we know admin doesn't inspire people to give. We still need to keep in mind that this is about inspiring donors to continue giving, even though some of them may have a hurdle in terms of the way they normally do that. So don't admin your donors is my big message for you to take away today. Always remember the why. We always need to be inspiring them to give. And this, what we're talking about today, is how you might help them maintain that giving, respond to that inspiration that they have, even though there might be a bit of a hurdle for them in terms of how they usually do that with us. Just noted a quick one on the Q&A there. I've seen some questions coming through. Please keep coming through with those. We'll do them at the end. Yes, you will get a copy of this presentation, though, was one of the ones that popped up in there. All right, so what can you do? The Cheque Working Group and individual charities have been working on ways to tackle this challenge, some in a bigger fashion than others, depending on how much risk they're exposed to. I think one thing to keep in mind too is your donors give to other charities. I know from the benchmarking program I've worked on for many years that the average donor in New Zealand is giving to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 organisations. Okay, so remember, your donors are going to be hearing about this from the other causes that they support as well. They also will be hearing about this from their banks. So you are not the only people speaking to these donors. Consider that the messaging will be being repeated for them. You're not the only ones out there. You're not yelling into a vacuum there with them. There are other industries that will be affected by this who will also be communicating with your donors, as they will be having to make payments in those industries as well. Okay, so let's have a look at the kind of key actions that you might take. For me, there's 4 key things that the organisations who've been working on this have come up with, and then I feel are really strong recommendations for you to look at today. It's know your risks, okay? So what revenue and donors might be at risk for you so that you can target what you're doing towards them, but also so you can report back into your organisation what you expect the risk might be, and that you can start reporting and tracking that as time goes on. The impacts of this will be felt for many years. It's not just going to be the month after cheques are taken away. And for those of you who run appeals programs, for example, you will know for many of those donors, you won't know if they've stopped giving for another 12 to 18 to 24 months. Some of your donors might be on a I give to you every second year cycle. So some of this is going to have sort of a long-term impact that you're going to need to keep on top of. Know what support is out there, and that's in part what this session is about today. And there's also going to be a bunch of resources available for you to keep accessing as time goes on. Set a plan, make sure you're reporting that inwards and upwards and reporting against it. Track, report and adjust. Because we don't know, we don't have any examples from other countries around the world where this has happened recently. That's why some of the Australians are on the line today too, because this is a great test case for them. Aussie fundraisers are going to have a better go of this, I think, once they are able to learn from what's happened here in New Zealand. Now, critically for me, one of the key things that's come out of all of the research the banks have done in particular is what donors or people affected are most concerned about, and this is our older cohort, so the 65 plus, is that they're concerned about security and trust. Okay, so this is one of the key things that you need to start considering. Okay, these donors are concerned, they're not often well informed about these issues, and confidentiality is of the utmost importance to them as well. So consider how your messaging and the way you're talking to donors responds to the idea that security and trust and confidentiality are really important to them in this place. All right, let's talk about assessing your risk. Okay, so who might this affect? And I would suggest to take a look back in the history of your data, who's given to you by cheque before, who are those people? I also would suggest you apply the 80-20 rule here. If you have limited resources and part of your plan is to communicate with these donors, who are the most important donors for you to be communicating with? Okay, who are the top 20%, for example? Who are the higher value donors? Who are maybe your confirmed bequesters? Who is the audience that it's really, really critical that you keep on board for the long term? Start with them and work your way backwards. Also, I think critically understanding how much repeat revenue the removal of cheques may affect. Okay, so was there revenue that you received last year or the year before via cheque that you don't expect to receive again? that is not risk revenue because it wasn't going to be repeated. What you're looking at here is the revenue that you would expect to receive again and again by people who pay via cheque. Okay, so for me to actually then saying we're going to identify who this affects and how much is being effective so that we can start to say, do we need any preemptive messaging for this group, this audience? Do we need shorter term support for them? Or are we looking at longer term reactivation strategies? Okay, so I've seen within the databases of several organisations, just even in the last couple of weeks, a really different mix. So each of those organisations is putting into play a different plan. For some, the preemptive messaging is really important, but for others, they're seeing that the audience is probably one that they're not going to know about the impact for a good kind of appeal cycle, 12-month cycle. So some of it is about what they're going to be looking at in terms of their longer term reactivation. Really critically though, remember you have attrition anyway. If you raised $100,000 last year that was paid for by cheque, are you realistically expecting to receive exactly that same amount again this year? Are some of those donors just expected to have stopped giving anyway? So understanding your attrition benchmarks is really critical here. Not everyone is going to be worth chasing up. Okay, so some people may be at the end of their giving cycle with you anyway. We know much older donors, often as they get into their 80s, for example, do stop giving to us because they go into retirement homes or someone takes over management of their finances. Some donors will use this as their rationale to stop giving. I think it's really important to make sure that your inbound donor care or supporter services is tracking this, noting it down. So for those of you who don't track cancellation or stop mailing me reasons that are coming in, this is a great time to start that as a standard practice. So you can start to assess what is really being impacted by this and what might be impacted by just normal reasons people stop giving. Again, start the education process internally. It is going to take a couple of years to know the full impact of this. But also we know from a reactivation perspective, we can reacquire donors. We can re-inspire donors to come back and start giving to us. Some people, it might take them a while to sort out their banking affairs or feel more comfortable with online banking or different methods of making payments. You still have the opportunity to keep inspiring those donors to maybe give again. I would suggest that you probably have at least a good 2 years to seek recovery, potentially of some people who do have to stop temporarily because they're sorting out their finances there. I do love a little flow chart like this. Thought I couldn't get away with not putting one in. This would be my suggested first pass. This is based on what I've seen several organisations doing already. And that is people looking at, hey, what is our risk? Who have recently paid us by cheque or made a donation by cheque? And I say recently because we know recent behaviour is the best indicator of future behaviour. So not what people did 5 years ago. I'm talking in the last 12 to 24 months there. Also, you might want to consider whether or not you are looking at people who just only ever donated via cheque versus those that have cheque payments but have used other methods as well. You might want to set them into two groups. I think it's a reasonable assumption to make that those who have used cheque and other methods are in a better position to continue using those other methods than people who have only ever made a cheque donation to your organisation. Really critical first pass is of those people who's still contactable. You will find that there are a bunch of people who've made donations to you recently via cheque who have also passed away, asked to not be contacted, have returned to sender mail. So actually you weren't able to future fundraise from them anyway. So that group is already gone from you. So we're looking at the group that's contactable there. I think it's worth splitting out your organisations and your individuals as well. I saw with one charity recently, they had included all of their cheque payments from organisations, some of their business partners, corporate and small business, realising that actually those organisations are in a different position to their individuals and they're going to have a different conversation or view the risk quite differently. And the expectation is that a business will work out how to make payments without cheques by force of having to keep their business going versus individuals that may be a little bit different. And then starting to look at the type of gifts too coming through. So I know people are starting to look at, well, last year we received a percentage of our revenue from brand new donors via cheque. Our expectation of subsequent giving from them is lower we have, our second gift rates, than of people who are long-term donors, those who've been making multiple gifts, versus maybe people who made a pledge. Also, remember, I know many of our bequest payments come in via cheques still. They're not going to be replicated. So again, counting them in your risk is probably the wrong thing to do. So you want to start to kind of triage or work through that data, so you've got a really good idea of what you're dealing with here. So, a basic example here is how many cheque donations only, no other payment methods on the donor record in the last 12 to 24 months. What would you normally expect to be repeated in the next 12 to 24 months? And do we split that out by new versus long-term donors? Thank you to one organisation who shared their data with me. I have changed the numbers just so that I'm not sharing confidential information. But this is literally what they did. They went in to see what their exposure to risk was, because originally they were thinking it was around about $500,000. Because that was all the gifts they received via cheque last year. They took out their organisations, they took out their uncontactable, they took out their do not mails and their no appeal donors. They've separated out their new donors as a separate audience that they're going to deal with. And they also separated then out people who pay by cheque, but also had other methods in their giving history. So they can actually see their actual exposure to risk is quite a bit lower than they're originally expecting. And the number of donors that they're dealing with is quite a bit fewer than they originally thought that they were going to need to deal with. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of how you might set about assessing your risk, so that you can then start tracking against that potential risk. I know for some, this comes down to actually being able to use this in their forecasting, set expectations for boards and bosses around where some revenue might be down as a result of this specific issue. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Michelle now, because one of the key areas here, as Michelle said earlier, is the banks are doing a lot. They all have different plans though, and it's important that maybe you're across those, but to understand that the banking sector is doing quite a lot to help this audience, particularly that older audience, because they also have identified them as the most kind of vulnerable to this being a challenge. So you, and within your organisation, being really clear on what the banks are actually doing, so that you're not one replicating or sending mixed messages out to donors, is really critical.
Thanks, Fee. Yes. So what are the banks doing? I think over the last 18 months, the FINZ working group, which started off with 10 or 12 members and grew quite significantly to about 25, 30 regular members, who were coming together at least once or twice a month, and then more frequently, more recently. And what we were able to do in that working group was really we were fortunate enough to be given access to the initial research through focus groups that Kiwibank did with the different age groups. And from that, and also some of the charities who really got ahead and started testing the different methods of communication, we kind of formulated some of the key things that we were able to identify the gaps, I think, in terms of how we can collaborate. I think it's so important that we work with the banks to do this. The banks are not our enemy. Ultimately, the long-term goal is for charities to be efficient and have our donors given in a way that still makes them happy and delightful, but also makes them more efficient for charities. So ultimately, I think the long-term goal of both the banks and us as charities are very similar. So we initially approached the Banking Association, and the Banking Association is there to represent the banks. It was explained to us in terms of competition law. We hoped we could go to the Banking Association with our list of requests, and they would send it out to all the banks, but it didn't quite work like that. So this has only just happened, I guess, in the last couple of 6 to 8 weeks. We have been connected via the Banking Association. Huge thanks to Roger at the Banking Association for giving us those direct access to those key people that will really help us understand the journey the banks are going on. I think the first thing that was clear to us was we didn't know what the journey was that the customers were going on. So we didn't know what communication they were receiving from their banks. And so we didn't want to be the people telling our donors that you can do this with your bank, when actually they went along to the bank and that actually wasn't what the banks were asking them to do. So it's really important that we listen to what the banks are communicating with our customers so that we are sharing those same messages with the donors and customers so that we don't look like we're telling donors to do something that they can't. So Fee, can you just open that first slide? So I think what I've done here is just created a general template. I've spoken to most banks, most of the big 5 banks, and all of them have generally accepted most of what's on these next 2 slides. I don't want to mention the specifics of each bank because we're still just finalising and tying up exactly what the final solutions are. But one of the first concerns was fees. There's $25 fees for setting up APs and direct debits or one-off donation fees. Most of the banks have said they understand that this transition is not the customers, this is not the customer's fault. They should not be penalised for transitioning their life to a digital or alternative method of paying. So during this transition, they are going to be waiving fees on transactional setups for APs and direct debits. Now, I'm not sure, we need to find out if Cassie, the big 5 banks are Kiwi Bank, ANZ, BNZ, ASP and Westpac. Your smaller banks and your building societies still used to process their cheques through these major banks as well. And so waiving the fees for that first transition is being done. I do need to understand a little bit more, and I'm going to go back to them about this. So if donors are already giving to charities and they're transitioning them, that's going to be, the fee's going to be waived. However, if in a few weeks' time someone decides they want to give to charity and would have written a cheque, will that fee be waived if they've never given to that charity before? So there's a little bit of work to be done around that, but I can confidently say that most banks want to work with us. They don't want to penalise donors for giving to charity, and they're going to be waiving those setup fees for APs and direct debits. One-off donation fees, again, there's a mixed response here. Walking into a branch, can your donors walk into a branch and give a cash donation to a charity of their choice? This appears to be a discretional fee at branch level. However, again, a couple of the banks have said, we don't know, we'll find out. A couple of them have said we're going to waive those one-off donation fees. Again, there's a bit of work being done on that, and as we get confirmation, we will be updating the statements from the bank in the portal, which we'll tell you about later. We want to make it easier for all charities to be listed in the pre-populated bill payees online banking. If you're not already in the pre-populated drop-down menu when you pay a bill or person and you start typing, and if you're not in that pre-populated list, make sure you, again, in the portal will be the forms for all the banks for your charity to apply to be on the pre-populated bill payee. One of the big things we've been talking about is the psychological language of giving versus paying a bill in the pay the bill section. And this is a big win for us because there is 2 banks. And again, I'm just a bit nervous about naming them right now, but there is 2 banks who have said that makes complete sense. And yes, one bank in particular has already pretty much given us confirmation that they're going to change the wording on their platforms so that it will say, pay a bill, pay a person, or donate to charity, which I think is a huge win for us. And we really want to see all banks make that language change to their online platforms. The other ones they want us to do for those banks who haven't quite heard just in the starting their real strong communications, they want us to be able to feed into the communications. So through the FINZ working group, we will be looking at some of the communications that banks are about to send out, and we are, we're going to be the conduit for kind of just reviewing the communications that banks are putting out, and if there's any suggestions as to how we can enhance the charitable giving side of the communications, then we will we're going to be able to collaborate and share on that. And add in a payment to charity. So some of the banks in their communications, they're sending out to their customers, these are the things that you can do to change your life to a digital or alternative way of paying. And some of the banks are already put into their communications, including payments to charities. So they're not just talking about utilities and insurances and anything else that you paid with cheque, they're also saying and payments to charities. It seems small, but it's getting us it's that visibility, it's that reminder that we're there and charity donations are still part of your life, restructuring to this new alternative way of paying. Excellent. So all banks are providing digital options and customer support tools that all charities can access and all customers can access. So we had Kiwi Bank doing the Dora bus, which is still around. We've got Better Banking workshops. Each bank has their own workshop, and they're designed to bring their customers into their branches, take them through the entire process, take them, they can do it in branch. There's kind of groups being done everywhere. We also know that Age Concern have been given some money for digital literacy programs. So again, encourage your donors to access these places if they're unsure, if they're not confident and they don't know what to do. The best thing you can do to your donors, if they're on the phone or if they've contacted you and they don't know what to do, they trust their banks. It's proven that donors trust their banks potentially a little bit more than they trust charities. So it's incredibly important that we encourage them to go to their bank. Their banks are set up to help them transition. As I said earlier, this is not our job. Digital banking workshops are popping up all over the country. There's a lot of money going into that. Banks have got extra phone support. Most of them are offering vulnerable priority lines, which are for people some of them they can jump to the front of the queue, and those people who really need some extra support, most banks have a vulnerable priority line, and it's important, and they should be communicating that to their customers. But again, it's information for you as charities to be able to share with your donors. A great idea we just had some great conversations with the banks, and this was an idea that a bank suggested to me and said, over the next few months it's going to be really busy, lots of noise in this space, but how about round about Christmas time? Because I highlighted that at Christmas there's certain times of the year that we won't know the impact of this because people won't write a check, maybe your check users that just give to your Christmas appeal. And they said, how about we do a generic giving campaign on the front page of our platforms to remind the generosity of New Zealand that you can give to charities online and you can give to charities digitally over the festive period. That is quite exciting. Once one bank suggested it, and I went back to the other banks and said, this is something one bank's doing, the other banks are like, that's a great idea. So that's kind of what this whole kind of organic conversation about is just sharing ideas, what's going to work, what would benefit our donors, what would benefit the bank's customers, and more importantly, obviously our charities. A lot of them are repurposing content to bring it back to surface information for their customers on how to give, on charitable giving, how-to videos. So they're bringing that information up to the surface for their customers and their donors, our donors, their customers, to be able to understand how they can do these things effectively.
Thanks, Michelle. I think there's a really good point there that some of the stuff that the banks are doing may help us replace some of our lost revenue. So their ideas of pushing charitable giving around Christmas, making things more obvious in online banking, those things may not help our more vulnerable 65 plus audience as they work their way through whether online giving is for them, but it may inspire our broader audience. So some of our other audiences, slightly younger audiences that are online already doing their banking through those processes. So in some way there is the idea that yes, some of the lost revenue may actually be replaced by some of the activity that's happening outside this. I might just address one question that I saw come up out of the corner of my eye here because it's quite relevant to this section, which was someone saying that you asked to be added to a bill payee list, but then ended up withdrawing because it was going to cause chaos with your finance team because you can't track who the donors are. I would encourage you to not let your own internal administration stop you from making giving easier for your donors. Okay, you're going to have to work out how to deal with that. But I would ask if there's anyone else on the line there who's recently or understands a little bit more about being added to that bill payee list and has some tips or ideas for how you might deal with the inbound donations and identifying who the donors are. It'd be great to share that with with the group here, but I do see this happen a lot. We look for a solution internally. We then realize that it's going to have to change a lot of processes or systems for us, and we don't do it. Please come at this from a donor perspective. Please come at this from making giving as easy as possible for your donors, which in some cases may make your life a little bit harder now, but you can always work on making your life easier as you go along. Not doing something because it's hard for you but easy for the donors isn't going to help your donors swap over. But also use the group. This has been a great experience for me to see how much fundraisers are sharing. So reach out to your colleagues in other organisations if you're facing some back-end operational administrative challenges. Someone else will have come across this at some point, and someone's probably dealt with it ages ago to try and deal with it. So anything new from that kind of banking side of things, reach out and see if you can overcome those issues with advice from other people in the group as well. Okay, so for me here, you've assessed your risk. So you've gone back and worked out a way to actually identify your risk and who your at-risk audiences are. I actually saw another question there just about the survey, the public survey that said, hey, look, you know, you've covered a lot of age groups, but if we've identified the 65 plus as the most at risk, is the survey actually missing the bigger picture detail here? Yes, possibly, but you've got to check your own risk internally. Not everyone has the same spread of donors or the same program. So the surveys help us understand kind of more top line across the industry where the issues might be. You need to drill down into your own donor base in particular and your own program to understand where your risk is. If you're an organisation with most of your donors over 80, your challenges are going to be different to someone who's got a big face-to-face program and has a spread of donors between the ages of 20 and 65 with a few over 65. So, but we do certainly understand from the banks and from our research that that older audience is the one that's going to have a bigger challenge there. All right, so how can we mitigate this risk? Just going to reinforce that idea that giving is about impact, not the method. So this isn't about adminning your donors. Deal with your admin in the background, keep inspiring the donors and showing them how easy it is to give. Remembering that security, trust and confidence are probably the challenges or the top line issues that our key audience is affected by. So how do you demonstrate that your ways of giving are easy, secure? How do you give people confidence that they can get on and do this without exposing themselves to risk? Get your information and options ready. I'm not going to go through, and I did see a few questions earlier about what options should we be offering our donors or what options do we think our donors are going to choose. We're not going to go through that in detail today. The portal will have some information for you so that you can explore all of your options there, but you need to get that in place now. I would encourage you to start looking. So for example, are you already set up to receive automatic payments and direct debits? I know some organisations aren't. This is a fabulous time for any of you who don't have monthly or regular giving programs to start looking at those. It's an amazing way to boost your program in the long term, sustainable giving, donors commit to it, but you do need to have things set up with your banks in order to offer that to your donors. You do need to have things set up in terms of your payment gateways and your processing each month to make that happen. Some of these things are quite a bit of paperwork and effort to make happen. So I encourage you to start looking at all those options. Decide what payment options you can offer. And this is about, again, your audience, what's appropriate for your audience. I'm not going to suggest that there is a list of these are the payment options that every charity should be offering. You have the opportunity to test as well, even down to the level of in your appeals, what order you offer your payment options on, how much you make of sending people online versus calling in to your organisation. You are in control of this. You have the opportunity to test and trial different ways of expressing and sharing this with your donors. One thing we did learn from the banks in particular, though, was that many of our older donors, or the older cohort affected here, aren't actually aware that direct debits or using their like Visa debit cards, for example, is an option for giving. For many of them, their understanding is it's cheques or credit card. Okay, so having a think about how you might express what those options are, how you might make them really easily accessible to your donors, and how you might express that they are a secure way to do that, that you are keeping their details confidential. So on that note, because safety and security appears to be the main concern here as well, a couple of suggestions is now, right away, start deprioritizing cheques as a method. Okay, you are going to have to take it off eventually. I saw one of the questions there was around acquisition and how we think the removal of cheques is going to affect direct mail acquisition, for example. Some of you could test this right now. If you've got some direct mail acquisition going out, send a very small cohort out without a cheque option on your response form and see what happens. Some people will give you cheques anyway, but actually see what the potential impact of that might be on your program going forward. Again, knowing that once the pain happens, some people will change their behaviour anyway. So you've got some opportunities to do some testing here because we don't know. There isn't any behavioural data for us to base our future forecasting on here. Some of this is going to be about guessing. Some of it is about testing and trialling, and you have an opportunity to do that now. But think about whether or not you're promoting your safe and secure payment methods there. What are your other alternatives? Also, I think, again, bring your people into this. When we look at the 65 plus cohort, something that they really, really value is service, customer service from real people. How much are you prioritizing promoting the real people in your organization? So not info at my charity and an 0800 number, but can you say, here's Fiona, and this is her direct email address and her direct line, and you can contact her and she can help you. Okay, a lot of people are afraid of putting real people's names and direct contact details on our communication. But if you're really serious about this audience and responding to their needs, providing them the best service possible, and that will be connecting them with real humans, could make the difference here for you. So start to think about how you might be able to change the way you're giving people access to your own people to support them. Other proactive actions that people have been using that we would recommend too there is make sure your phone number is highly visible. Again, this audience is 65 plus. If you consider by the age of 40, all of your eyesight is going to start to decline and will continue to do so for the rest of your life. This is an audience who needs to have very large font on the things that you print. If you are sending communications to this audience on DL and size 10 font, they're unlikely to be consuming it. They're unlikely to be able to find your phone number so they can speak to your great humans that can help them on the other end of the line in there. So think about where your phone number is and is it visible and easily accessible, and who answers the phone. I think really importantly, some people don't actually know where their phone numbers end up. Just test them out to make sure you're popping the right phone numbers on there. Do you do, for example, an insert in appeals? And I've seen quite a few organisations doing this. I think some of them are great. My feedback would be some of them are very administrative and unrelated to the reason that people are supporting your organisations. So make sure you go back to the why and the inspiration there with those pieces. Check out your response forms, okay? So many of this audience use our paper printed forms to respond back to us. Are they super easy? Are they super simple to follow? Are they big enough font? Is there enough white space on there? Is there tiny writing that will make someone suspicious that you're trying to hide something from them? Ones of response forms that usually improves response regardless. Okay, so this is a good opportunity there. Maybe you need to talk to these donors. Should we be calling all of them who pay by cheque right now up until the deadline of cheques being removed, thanking them and having a conversation with them, just having a chat and a check-in to see what their plans are moving forward? Do you call all of them, post an appeal if they would normally give to that campaign via cheque, but you haven't heard from them? Okay, this is an opportunity there for you to have a great donor care interaction and maybe troubleshoot a pain point, maybe direct them to resources that are available through Age Concern or through their banks. What about donor care? Okay, reinforcing the impact that they are having. So if someone's in a position where they're having to consider whether or not they can keep giving because cheques have been taken away, are you giving them enough inspiration to go, actually, it's worth it for this organisation. I'm going to work out how to do this. I'm going to contact them. So consider whether or not you have told your donors how amazing they are and the impact that they're having recently, and what the right timing might be to do that when cheques are removed from the system. think about your messaging. The portal's going to have resources and examples in there for you. Again, the working groups have been amazing in sharing their resources and their examples, and the collateral and their data in there as well. I think I've said this quite a few times, but this is about inspiring your donors. There's a little wee example there of where you might start, you know, talking about we still need you. If your preferred method is this, please continue, etc. So actually just thinking about the language that you might use and what messaging. We do know that people need to see messages over and over and over again. One insert and an appeal probably only reached a very, very small percentage of your target audience, okay? You are going to need to repeat this over and over again. And in some cases, some of the things you come up with will just become your standard practice as you go forward. You will find reinforcing certain things as having a positive outcome across your program. What's some other proactive solutions? Michelle mentioned the populated bill payee list there. There's some resources in the portal. I encourage you to make sure your privacy policy is up to date and you know who your privacy officer is within your organisation. There have been some changes to the privacy legislation recently. There is going to be more scrutiny in this space just for our organisations in general. If we're talking about trust and confidentiality here, being able to express that you've got an up-to-date privacy policy, that you've got a privacy officer if someone needs to talk to them is really important. I can still see many of you have no expression of your privacy policy on your communications. You're not offering donors an opportunity or a clear way to opt out or change the way that you communicate with them. That's a big risk for some of you. I think this is important within the context of these checks being removed as well to look at. Do you have frequently asked questions available, FAQs for everyone internally, including your board? Show the board that you're on top of this. Boards are becoming more and more concerned about this as an issue. So get on the front foot, make sure you're training people within your organisation and sharing that information. This is who our at-risk audience is. This is how we're tackling it. These are the key messages. These are the different payment methods that we've instituted if you're bringing new ones in, for example. And really critically, this is an opportunity for some of you to seek some investment to improve your online donation experience or that donation funnel, because online is one of the places that we will be directing donors. We know for our very much older donors, it may not be the best option, but for some in their slightly younger cohorts, this is where they will be going. If you are sending people online to give, have you put the time into making sure that that is a really good experience? When I get to your homepage, is it really, really obvious where I click to donate? Is the donation funnel, that experience, simple, straightforward, optimized? Have you been testing it? There's some great people and organizations out there that can help you with this. But if your solution is online and your online experience is terrible, your solution isn't a solution today. Okay, so you may need to invest in that space. But for some of you, this just might be the opportunity to get that budget that you've been seeking to date to try and improve that space. The other end of this, checks will be removed and some donors will find it difficult to give and it will take them a while to come around to or find different ways to do this. So reactivation is going to need to be part of your plans, and that might be 12 months, 24 months, 36 months, okay? But again, not everyone will be worth chasing, so make sure you report on who you've decided not to spend money on chasing if that is the case. Some will use this as their rationale, report back, okay? A lot of times we use anecdotal, one person told us it was the removal of checks and therefore that's why we've lost all this revenue. Please don't do this. Please get data. Please make sure that you are making assertions about the right things. Ask people, follow them up, phone them. The phone's going to be your friend in this scenario there. Keep reporting and assessing. Okay, this was the risk that we thought. This is the revenue we thought we might lose. This is how well we're going at keeping those donors or recovering that revenue there. And possibly over the next couple of years, you might want to consider force including previous check donors into your communications that you might have normally excluded. You might have some segmentation and targeting rules. You might actually want to force include these audiences for a period of time, knowing that it might take them a little bit longer to sort out how they might give to you there. Okay, I'm just wondering here, Michelle, do you want to take a look at a couple of the questions, or should we keep pushing through around FINZ support and then come to questions at the end, because I've just seen a few popping up the side.
Yeah, let's go to questions, because it'd be nice to wrap up with the end on the next steps.
I will, yeah. So I'm going to whiz through down here. Anyone who's popped any questions in the chat, if you can throw them over into the Q&A there. It is quite hard to follow questions in the chat. So there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen there. If you just want to type them over and we can drop them over. I'll just head down from the top to the bottom. Do you know what payment methods donors are most likely to switch to if they've previously donated by cheque? I don't for your organisation. It does appear to be slightly different depending on the program that charities have had, but all of you should have some data around this, at least some anecdotal data in that you can look at the donors who have given by cheque and other methods. What's the most popular method? Some of it's going to come down to the age of your donors, and I am 100% aware that we don't have a lot of great age data. I think you can assume though that if your donors have been giving to you for 10 or more years, they're probably in our 65 plus cohort there.
Yep. Fee, is there anyone from the working group who have already done a lot of work, maybe might want to jump in and respond there? Has anyone from the working group in the audience want to comment on the preferred method?
Yeah, I'd be fascinated to know, to see where your donors
But there will be examples in the portal. That's the kind of information we have been sharing. The portal will keep growing. Minnie's had to do a great amount of work in a short time, but these kind of things will be in there.
Yeah. We'll just wait to see if anyone type that into the chat there if you've got any thoughts on what the kind of main methods or method that your donors have moved to or you expect them to move to. You know, what's the best thing we can tell our cheque donors about how they can donate into our bank online? Again, this is really critical around your messaging. You need to decide internally how far down the route of supporting your donors with that you're going to go. I know I've heard a few examples of within organisations, people spending very long amounts of time on the phone with donors trying to talk them through using their online banking. You need to consider whether that's the right thing for you to be doing and it's a good use of your time, or whether it's about pointing the donors to the support they can get from their banks and giving them the right information. An organisation the other day was telling me about a great idea they have. I won't tell you the details of it, but how they've provided their donors with the information they need in a really easy, accessible format, should they go online to give or should they go into a bank to donate. They've got the information they need to share or type in to hand in order to make that easier there for them.
I see we've had Charlotte respond to that first question, saying that they've had quite a mixed response, but some donors are doing it over the phone, but debit cards have been a lifesaver. Small sample size, but definitely a win for some.
Love it. Brilliant. Yeah, so I do, and it's interesting. I think it'll be a bit of a mix there. Oh, just on the bank payee list, someone's given us a nice comment there in the chat as well. You can request wording in the reference section of the payment which directs the donor to put in their donor ID. I know I have to do that for my insurance payments, for example, and my AA payments. So there are things that you can do to direct your donors to help you out with that information there. Fiona from Volunteer Service Abroad said most cheque donors are switching to direct debit into our bank account or filling out the credit card debit details on the donation form. Probably about a 50-50 split based on the data they have so far from the Christmas appeal and their appeal are doing right now. Thank you, that's really super helpful. You could probably just use that as a basis and then test as you go forward.
Fiona is one of our members of our working group and has been incredibly proactive. So yeah.
Brilliant. Another one there saying bank debits seem to be the popular transition, followed by the phone. In there. Another question there is, one of our biggest risk concerns is acquisition. Has any, and this is a question back out to the group there, so it'd be great to get any responses in the chat. Has anyone started trying to pave ways for different payment methods with acquisition, with any success of giving and actually acquiring the donor's details? So I think, and there's another one here, you know, the direct impact on direct mail acquisition. So I think acquisition is a big concern. You've got the opportunity right now before checks are gone to start doing a little bit of testing or trialing as well. But I also think you'll need to do testing and trialing post this. So we're almost going back to, unfortunately, the days of a little bit more uncertainty. So I know some of you have acquisition programs where you're pretty able to forecast what's going to happen. You're probably moving into a phase here now where it's more going back to a little bit of a test and learn scenario. You might need to set expectations internally that your returns from acquisition may take a bit of a dip as you learn to adjust to this situation.
If do you mind if I jump in and answer a question that came in at the bottom here from Tessa in regards to deadlines for banks? Thank you, Tessa. I had that in my notes and didn't cover it. So each bank, it starts on the 30th of May. May, June, July, August is the last bank. The ASB are the final bank to go on the 31st of August. They have made it very clear that because they're the final bank, it's a hard deadline. That day is the final day. The other banks, starting from May, have all said, yes, there will be a grace period of 2, 3, 4 weeks. Kiwi Bank had a grace period, I think, of about 3 or 4 weeks, which meant anyone that writes checks in the week before or the day before the deadline, their checks were honoured. So yes, for every bank apart from ASB, there will be a 2-3 week grace period for processing those checks, but the ASB is a hard deadline.
Thank you. Question here from Kristen, please comment on New Zealand Post as a payment option, because noted they're 65% plus who like to pay by cash, about 27%. How can they do this? Is New Zealand Post an option there? Michelle, do you have any comments on that, or does any of the working group have comments?
So you can let your donors know that if they still want to donate make a cash donation, they can go along to their local branch, which is, I know, another controversy, but they can go along to their bank with cash and make a donation to their charity. If they have any questions, redirect them to their bank, but cash donations can be made. So one of I'm going to throw it in there as an interesting one, Presbyterian Support down in Otago. Some of their donors had said, I give by cheque. I don't want to, that's the only way I want to give. However, I am in your shop every other week. And so what they have done is created a way for their supporters to go into their shop and be able to donate via FPOS on the machines in the shop, which I think is actually a really great, for those charities that have got shops, why not utilise that face-to-face interaction and set up a donation line there?
Yeah, I think this is really pushing us to start to think about our different channels to donors. So I think there might be a little bit of innovation coming around from this as well. Josh actually said, are there many or any well-regarded apps on the donor side that could be reasonably easy enough to be used as an alternative? For example, PushPay in the early days. Fantastic question. My answer to that is not that I've seen, but there may be people in this space. Again, apps are a digital solution for our key sort of risk audience, the 65 plus, potentially not an option for them, but for the audience coming up behind them, maybe. But thus far, particularly from a benchmarking perspective, we've seen very little revenue at volume being generated by those apps. I don't know if anyone has.
I think there is somebody in the audience. I think there's QR codes springing up. And there are suppliers in this in the sector for this kind of market. They're springing up every day. There are lots. I'm not going to mention them by name because there's lots of them, and that would be unfair. But there are, watch this space. I think there's going to be some innovation here.
Yeah. Again, and that might be about the audience coming up behind our slightly older audience. What's useful for them. All right, keep your questions coming through there. I am going to pop back onto our presentation here because Michelle is going to give us a bit more detail on the support that you can get from FINZ as well as outside the industry there. Over to you, Michelle.
Sure, thank you. As we've been mentioning throughout the whole session, the Cheque online portal is going to launch today. We are putting this in the secure section of our website, so you are going to have to log in, and in there will be the portal. Minnie has been so busy putting so much information over the last 18 months into the portal. It is a work in progress. It's organic. We're looking for feedback. We're a tiny team punching above our weight on this one. So if you've got any ideas or suggestions on how we can improve it, please let us know. Also in there, one of the most exciting things for me has been the sharing and the collaboration. The working group have been incredible. I have never seen a group of charities who have really shared their IP, shared this is the DMs we have sent out. This was the template that worked for us. There's a couple of real big ones there. I know Mary Potter Hospice did some amazing work, and SPC. There's really great stuff, and our charities have allowed this collateral and these examples and these templates for language and wording to be in the portal. So they're in there, and we are going to try and work on kind of slimming it down to our top 5 or our top 10 kind of choices, because I think there's a lot to choose from. But a huge thanks to our charities for being able to share. And what we encourage over the next few months is for you to share your things. You know, take out the critical IP stuff that you don't want to share, or maybe have some criteria on, if you want to use this, please let us know. I mean, we'll all use this in a way that is respectful and understanding and has transparency as the things that we uphold as FINZ members. But the portal will be accessible straight after this webinar. We have been able to, because of the grants we received from the lotteries, to make this year an inclusive year for all charities in New Zealand. For 2021, all charities can now join FINZ either as a micro membership, which has criteria in terms of income for $50, or there is a discretionary no-cost membership. Both of these applications are now on the front page of the FINZ website. We don't want any charity to be disadvantaged because they can't afford the cost of a FINZ membership to access the portal and the ongoing support to the sector. So that was really important that we were able to do this through the grant that we were able to receive and pick up the administration for that mentorship. So this is, in a sense, this is something I need to develop, but it's something the working group have suggested, that those people in the working group might be able to provide some support to people that really don't have a clue where to start, and might be off, even if it's just, you know, a 30-minute phone call to get them going with just bullet points questions that they need to. So we're looking at mentoring, we're looking at the working group and how they can support other charities. It's so important that we collaborate and we share and we support each other. And if we can set up any networking or online group, we're going to look at all of those things. And we've got the FINZ working group who's still meeting at the moment. After this webinar, I will be taking back a bit of control over that group, because it's been so amazing at managing themselves. I need to work out how to manage that, so it's less onerous on them. But we will be meeting at least once a month again, so you can join the working group. And just remember, we're your voice. We are the voice and the conduit between the sector and the banking sector. So if all of the information the banks are giving us, if they're reinforcing that this is what we should be doing, and then that's not being transferred to our donors, you've got to let us know. We will bring that information back to the banks. The banks are really keen to hear where the gaps are, where what they think is happening is falling down. So that's where we can help. So please let us know if it's not what's not working and what is working. And we're just going to end on a couple of final slides. DIA Charity Services have been watching closely what we've been doing. Sorry, the slide they gave us didn't quite fit into our presentation, but they want us to remind these last 2 slides of their thoughts on this: to promote safe giving to your supporters. They want to encourage your supporters to use the charities register to check they're donating to the right charity, and to do a review of your financial policies and procedures to make sure that they enable safe giving. And if collecting personal information, remember your duties under the Privacy Act. And they have mentioned in the notes here that unscrupulous people will take advantage of the end of checks, and the best you can do to help this is to encourage safe giving, encourage your donors to use the charities register. Every charity has a unique registration number. Charities have a unique link to send to people directly to their entry in the charities register that has your details, including your website, your financials, and your purpose. Encourage your supporters to look into the groups that they donate to. And also, if you don't have them already, introduce clear financial procedures, especially if you deal with cash. You can find great examples in the community net, Aotearoa. Don't collect credit card details over the phone. That's a big one. I've seen it happen in charities I've worked with. It's unsafe and it can make donors not trust your charity. So use online banking tools discussed earlier. And if you're collecting personal data of donors, remember you have obligations, again, as we mentioned, under the Privacy Act. Any questions or support, charity services have their operations staff available through their website. Charity services always available to answer questions. They won't accept filing fees paid by cheque from June 2021. but you can pay online using internet banking. And one of the sessions available with advisors and charity services every Thursday. You can book time with people from their community operations, and they give advice on funding options for community groups too. And also check out their website for their latest up-to-date details and get yourself on their newsletter. Thank you to the team at DIA for allowing us to include them in our webinar, and also for quietly supporting the work that FINZ are doing in this space.
Brilliant. So we've got a few minutes left before the end here. I've just jumped into the Q&A. We've got one other question in there. If anyone's got any questions or even comments, anything that you think we've missed, anything that you think we need to delve into further for you as fundraisers, as charities, let us know. We've just had a question there about, do we mind touching base with New Zealand Post to ensure that they are ready to accept donations by cash, debit or credit cards? Not sure the status there, Michelle.
Is that Kiwi Bank?
No, New Zealand Post. So the actual post office.
Okay, yeah, good point. I have not contacted New Zealand Post. I will add. Just another one there. I noticed somebody has asked about waiving fees for the transition period. What's the start and end date? And that's the kind of detail that I don't have from the banks. You're right. You know, if someone in November decides to, I suspect people are going to. They need to pay their bills. So I think it will happen quicker than we think. I don't think people will wait 6 months to pay their utility bill. So I think it will naturally happen when it's meant to, and during that whole time, those fees will be waived, is how I think banks will interpret it, but I will get clarification on that.
Yeah, so that'll keep getting updated as FINZ has information to hand. We will have a dig around there and see with New Zealand Post. I know in many rural locations, Kiwi Bank has been absorbed into New Zealand Post. So they actually have a bank window as well as a postal window. So they may just have a process there to send people to the bank part of it as opposed to the postal part of it, but we can dig around in there. I do encourage you to keep flicking questions through to the working group, things that you might have concern on or things that you learn. I think probably we'll look at doing something similar to this in a while, just with anything new that we have updated as well. But as a reminder, this deck will be available to you, and really, really encourage you to get into that portal there. We just check if we've got any more questions there. Let's see. Some corporates have stopped receiving payments through New Zealand Post as there were fees attached. Just a heads up pre-conversation with them. Thanks, Charlotte. That's really useful to understand. I think they're a channel we need to just check out. Greg from IHC, we have a number of donors at IHC saying this will be their last donation. We've given a new database category of once a year newsletter update. These are the donors that could be requested, so nice to keep in contact. Yes, absolutely, and that's kind of behind my make sure you've got the humans really visible for your donors. We want them to talk to you so that you can negotiate. Even someone who is saying, hey, look, it's come to the end of it for me. I'm really not going to be able to find another way to give. They may be an amazing bequest prospect. They may, in fact, find a way to give in the future, and that might be just their short-term pain. So how do you keep them on your file? How do you keep the opportunity to keep communicating with them? I love your once a year newsletter update, for example. And for those donors, you would be checking in on them in particular just to see if there is a way you could support them giving again as well. All right, was there anything else in the Q&A? I've got 27 boxes open here. No, that one's done. All righty. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for your contributions and your questions. I want to say thank you to Michelle and the team at FINZ and the FINZ working group. I've never really seen a collaboration like this happen so fast with so much effort and enthusiasm. It's really cool. I hope the guys watching from Australia have been able to take some ideas from this as well, and our Aussie counterparts hopefully don't have as tough a time as we do, but I don't know, the Aussie banks may be even more painful than the Kiwi ones. We'll see there.
And Fee, well, yeah, I need to say a huge thank you to Fee. I just got Fee on board in the last month or two, and I knew she would just bring this together in a way that nobody else can. Your knowledge and understanding is just phenomenal, and you've just done exactly what was needed for this. And I hope you stay with us to do this journey, and yeah, I think bring you back to do an update on this. So
I'm
thanks to
fascinated.
thanks to lotteries and being able to fund our ability to do this as well. So thank you to everyone. Thanks to the working group, and thank you all for being here today.
Cool. Jump into the chat box there too if you want the link to the portal. Minnie's just popped it in there right now, but it will also come out in an email following this up as well. So lovely to virtually see you all, and look forward to seeing how it all rolls out for everyone. We'll see you again soon.
See you later.
Thank you.